After obtaining the legendary Berserker armor, Guts does everything in his power to tame the beast within, as he battles against a group of crocodiles and a massive sea monster. All that and more in this week's extremely action-packed and super bloody episode of Berserk. Before I go any further in the review, let me just say that this one is going to be a smaller one because just yesterday I had 2 of my wisdom teeth removed in my upper jaw, and I am a little sore. I can't talk that loud, and I frankly don't want to talk for that long. And really, I don't have that much to say about this week's episode of Berserk. I've been sticking up for this anime adaptation since the very first season, but this was the very first episode which honestly began to rub me the wrong way, mostly because they seem to be ignoring certain parts of the manga and cutting them out altogether. And I know it's kind of unfair to compare the anime version to the manga version, but there are some crucial plot points that they are cutting from this anime adaptation, which frankly, I think is a really bad idea. I really don't think we're ever going to get the perfect anime adaptation of Kentaro Miura's dark fantasy series, and I guess this is what we're just going to have to work with right here. Honestly, if you want to digest the story in another medium outside of the manga, I recommend checking out Berserk and the Band of the Hawk, the PS4 video game. It's not perfect, but honestly, it's doing things a little better than this anime adaptation. And this episode right here was basically all about Guts trying to control the power of the Berserker armor, which not only basically destroys his body, but causes him to go into a Berserker-like state, where not only will he attack his enemies, but his friends as well. The first half of the episode I actually thought was the strongest element, and that's saying a lot considering that I'm an action junkie. I really did appreciate the scenes between Shirke and Guts. I especially love that Shirke basically just broke down right there about the death of her master and even had to look to Guts for someone to actually console her. Not to mention, she seems to have the hots for the Black Swordsman, which leads to a lot of funny scenes between her and Eva Lara. Not to mention Guts himself. But right after this, we go back to them as they're hanging out on the beach when suddenly they're attacked by this giant army of crocodiles, the ones that were seen at the very end of the last episode. They're being controlled by the Kushans with some dark magic. Essentially, they're able to imbue real animals with sentience, giving them the ability to use weapons, which in retrospect sounds really awesome. I mean, what's more scarier than a crocodile? A crocodile that's wielding a spear. And this is basically just an excuse to see Guts and his friends go out and just slice some crocodile ass. And it looks really cool for the most part. There are definitely some scenes which look a little better than others. However, I think they did a great job of actually translating this scene from the manga version. It's not until this giant beast, which is called a Makara, actually appears, where honestly, I don't think they did the series any justice whatsoever. It's basically this, like, giant whale elephant creature, and I don't know, just the overall movements of this thing and Guts' battle with it really just didn't impress me all that much. There were a lot of scenes that were taken from the manga, like actually seeing its, like, nose get cut off and everything, and then we have the big scene where Guts actually gives in to the power of the Berserker armor, which admittedly does look really cool when it starts to creep up over the back of his head and chomp down, and you get to see all of this blood oozing from its mouth, and then he just goes on a rampage, and all that stuff is really great, and in some ways actually looks better than its actual introduction in the previous episode, but it just doesn't blow me away that much. There's still some scenes here that I just wish looked a little bit better than what I saw in the actual manga version. Frankly, I just don't feel it's doing it justice. That and, of course, the fact that they're still cutting a lot of important story elements from this adaptation. Just like in the manga version, Guts defeats all of his enemies when suddenly he starts to turn on all of his friends, and it's up to Shirke who actually decides to bring him back, and suddenly he gains control again of the Berserker armor, which basically leads to him realizing that if he's going to go any further, he's going to have to try and tame the beast within, and he has a number of warnings from the Skull Knight saying that if he succumbs to the power of the Berserker armor, he could lose himself forever. Not to mention, the Skull Knight also points them in the direction of Puck's home, which is the home of all the elves, as well as their leader, Hanafubuku, who will make an appearance much later on in the series. That is, of course, if there is going to be a third season. The episode ends in what I think is probably the weakest part of the episode, when we have Guts actually coming back to his senses, and during this entire scene, they're playing the credits over it. You can't even see the animation half the time. You can't even see the subtitles. It's just kind of distracting and kind of sort of just took me out of the moment. And it was sort of like the straw that broke the camel's back, at least for me when it comes to this adaptation. I'm definitely going to finish out the series, but I have to admit I am slightly disappointed. So what's the rundown on this week's episode of Berserk? It wasn't very good. Let me make a few things clear. The actual action in this episode looked pretty cool. There were a lot of great scenes. I especially loved when Guts actually got into the Berserker armor and he was fighting against the crocodiles. There was one scene from the manga that I'm glad they kept intact when he actually, like, shish kebabs, like, an entire group of them and basically just, like, stabs through multiple ones at once. There's just a lot of great moments with him cutting them, like, completely down the middle, and it's just bloody and awesome. The giant sea monster, however, I just don't think looked that great in this series. I mean, obviously when compared to the manga version, which has such extreme detail, it just pales in comparison. But my biggest issue with this episode is that they continue to cut a lot of really important plot elements from the story. In the manga version, there's this whole other subplot where there's this mysterious child who just appears from nowhere who has a very strong connection to Casca and Guts. Basically, this child is sort of a representation of that one freaky, like, child that was attached to them earlier on in the series, which was devoured by that weird egg apostle. And this is basically, in my theory, like, what would their child have actually looked like. And it was really important to Casca's story as well as Guts's, and they just completely omitted it from this part of the story. Maybe they're planning to include this character at a later point, I'm not really sure, because they're also skipping a lot of other big important elements, most of which have to do with Griffith's brand new Band of the Hawk, which I'm theorizing maybe they'll get into it maybe when we get to a third season, but we're just going to have to wait and see. Otherwise, I just didn't really like this episode that much, and a lot of that does have to do with the fact that I'm still kind of soured from last week's episode, which I initially gave a 4 out of 5. Honestly, I'm bumping it down to a 2. Like, I've had a little more time to think about the episode, and I'm just disappointed by it. I can't lie about it. That's just the way I feel, and that's kind of the way I feel about this episode right here. Little by little, it seemed like the second season was starting to pick up in terms of its quality, and then suddenly they just dropped the ball again, and it's such a crucial point of the story. That's not to say that you can't get some enjoyment out of this anime adaptation, especially if you're already a fan of the Berserk manga series. There are moments that look really cool, and most of those do involve the Berserker armor. But for the most part, this is honestly just kind of a disappointment for Berserk fans. I can't really speak for those who don't read the manga, as because I do collect the manga series personally, I kind of already know what's going to be happening. But for people who actually don't read the manga, I don't know how they're going to feel about it. And honestly, I'd love to hear your opinion on it. But like I said, I'm giving this one a 2 out of 5. I'm just a little disappointed by some of the storytelling elements and some of the moments, but there's still some cool things here to see, and if anything, it's a great way to kill 20 minutes. So check it out, Berserk fans, but if any of you did watch the episode, make sure to tell me what you thought about it in the comments section below. Did you like this episode? Did you not like this episode? Is there any hope for the Berserk anime in the future? Maybe they need to redo this entire thing from scratch, I'm not really sure. But I'd love to get your thoughts on that, and you can tell me in the comments section below. Thank you all so much for watching this review. I know the energy is not as high as usual, like I said. I just had my wisdom teeth removed, and thank God I'm not really in an awful amount of pain, but I am a little sore up in here. I do plan on finishing the rest of my reviews for the weekend, and hopefully I'll be completely healed by next weekend, so I can get back to my more louder, boisterous self. So there it is. Make sure to subscribe to the channel for all things Berserk anime related. Leave me a comment telling me what you thought about the episode, and of course, if you like this video, please give it a thumbs up. I'll see you guys next time. Take care, and as always, stay dandy, baby.